The ship had been sitting in Bay 7 for 11 days before anyone told me it belonged to someone important. That's not unusual out here. The Meridian Station repair yards are the kind of place where anonymity is currency. Ships come in with transponders scrambled, hull markings painted over, manifest codes that don't match any registered registry in any of the 12 settled systems. We don't ask. We patch what's broken, charge what's owed, and send them back into the dark. That's the job. That's been the job for the 6 years I've worked the overnight shift on the primary maintenance floor. The long, quiet hours between last bell and first light when it's just me, the diagnostic consoles, and whatever's bleeding out on the dock. I'm not a mechanic by training. That's the first thing I tell anyone who asks, and usually the last thing they hear before they stop caring. I'm a systems integrator, used to work for a company called Veldtech back on Helios Station, corporate AI synthesis, cross-platform neural harmonics, that kind of work. Work that required degrees I'd spent 7 years earning, certification panels that sat in judgment over work I'd been doing competently for 3 years before I was allowed to do it officially. Security clearances I had to renew every 18 months with a thoroughness that made me feel like a suspect in a crime that hadn't been committed yet. The work paid well. The work was genuinely complex, genuinely important, the kind of thing that maybe 200 people in the settled systems could do at the level Veldtech needed it done. It also required me to sit in a glass-walled office on the 47th floor of a corporate tower and touch nothing with my hands. Every output went through review. Every system I designed got filtered through a committee that understood it less than I did and changed things anyway. I spent 3 years building frameworks that were technically brilliant, and then watching them get simplified into mediocrity by people who were afraid of brilliance they couldn't personally verify. I walked away in the middle of my 6th year, voided the contract, paid the penalty, and booked passage to the outer Meridian on a ship I could barely afford. The reasons, as I said, don't matter now. What matters is that I ended up here, in the grease and the plasma burns, and the cold that the station's heating system can never quite push out of the lower maintenance levels, doing shift work that theoretically any certified tech could do, and practically almost no one can do quickly enough to keep the yard from falling behind schedule. My supervisor, a barrel-shaped woman named Olathe who communicates primarily through sighs and the occasional pointed silence, once told me I had the worst attitude and the best diagnostic instincts she'd ever seen in the same human being. I took it as a compliment. She meant it as one, I think, though I've never been entirely certain. The overnight shift has a particular texture that the day crews don't understand and generally don't want to. It's quieter, obviously. The heavy commercial traffic moves on day schedules, the customer-facing work, the inspection runs, and the ceremonial handoffs. But it's also more honest. At 2 in the morning, a ship is just a ship. Its problems are just problems. There's no one to perform competence for, no one to impress, no audit trail to manage. There's the system, and there's the fault, and there's me. And either I find it or I don't. And either I fix it or I flag it and wait for morning. I've been finding it and fixing it for 6 years. Bay 7 is at the far end of the primary floor, past the bulk freighters and the pleasure yachts and the mid-range haulers that make up 90% of our throughput. It's the big bay, the one with the reinforced ceiling and the heavy-lift crane rigs, and the internal atmosphere seal that we use maybe twice a year for the really serious salvage cases. The seal is the key feature. Whatever atmosphere you run in Bay 7 stays in Bay 7, which is why it's the preferred dock for ships that have had life support damage or contamination issues, or for ships that don't want their internal atmosphere sampled by station sensors. The latter is more common than the official logs reflect. I noticed the ship my first night back from leave. Hard not to. It was easily the largest vessel I'd seen docked here in 3 years, possibly longer. Some kind of deep-range explorer class, the hull configuration suggesting Vrenthi manufacture at its base but modified so heavily that the original design was more suggestion than blueprint. Long, dark, built like something that had been in a dozen arguments and won all of them and wasn't particularly proud of it. The hull showed repairs over repairs, not the uniform commercial patchwork of a yard like this one, but the organic accumulation of work done in the field, by hand, over years. Different materials, different techniques, the same underlying precision, as if someone had made a commitment to this vessel and honored it continuously across thousands of hours of maintenance. The burn marks were what stopped me. They ran across the aft section of the hull in parallel lines, evenly spaced, with a precision that had nothing random about it. Not weapon fire, not impact scarring, those have chaos to them, the fractal scatter of kinetic events. These were clean, controlled. They went in at a specific angle and terminated at a specific depth, and they ran in parallel because whatever had made them had been designed to run in parallel, multiple emitters firing simultaneously at a single defined target area. I stood in the gantry above Base 7 for a long time that first night, looking at those burn marks with the diagnostic part of my brain running, and the part of my brain that was supposed to be clocking off for the day refusing to do so. Methodology, precision. Intentionality. I filed it away and went home. The dock assignment board listed the ship under a transit code and a holding flag. No owner name. No contact information. No repair order on file. No maintenance request. No authorization form. Just the transit code and the holding flag, and when I dug a little deeper, a payment deposit substantial enough that Olathe's supervisor's supervisor would have noticed it if they'd been paying attention, which at that level of the organization they almost certainly were not. Someone wanted this ship cared for. Someone was paying significant money for it to sit in a sealed bay with climate control and security logging. Someone just hadn't shown up to say what it needed. The morning crew walked past it on their way to the work orders. The afternoon crew did the same. I watched the dock assignment board for 4 days and the ship's file didn't change. On the 5th night I went in. Not because it was my job, it wasn't, not without a work order. Not because I was authorized, I wasn't, not precisely, though the language in my maintenance contract about preliminary assessments of unattended vessels in the yard was flexible enough to make a reasonable argument. I went in because I'd been watching those parallel burn marks for 4 nights, and the pattern of them had burrowed into the part of my brain that used to get paid very well to find patterns in things. And that part of my brain was not going to let go until I understood what I was looking at. The exterior hatch was sealed but not locked, or rather, it was locked against standard station access protocols. But when I ran a harmonic resonance scan on the mechanism, I found it was the old Vrenthi 3-pulse sequential type, a lock design that had been standard on deep-range vessels 15 years ago before the industry consolidated on integrated biometric systems. I knew the bypass for that lock because I'd spent 6 months integrating Vrenthi secondary systems into a corporate orbital when I was 24, young enough to be given the tedious jobs and old enough to actually learn from them. I'd reverse-engineered the 3-pulse sequential out of pure boredom one long night, and never found a reason to use that knowledge until now. The hatch opened. I went inside. The interior was dark, cold, ozone-scented, with that secondary smell underneath I'd noticed from the gantry, dry metallic, like circuitry that had been running continuously for a very long time. Main power in standby. Internal lighting at 5%. Atmosphere processors on minimum, enough to keep the air breathable but no comfort in it. I found the primary access corridor and followed it inward, mapping with my handheld scanner as I went. The interior confirmed the exterior suggestion, Vrenthi base architecture, heavily modified. But the deeper I went, the more the modifications revealed themselves as something more than functional upgrades. Entire sections of the original design had been gutted and rebuilt in different materials, with different logic, as if the person doing the work had looked at what the factory had given them and said, "I understand what you were trying to do here, and I can do it better." The workmanship was extraordinary. I don't use that word the way people use it when they're trying to sound enthusiastic about something competent. I mean that I stopped twice in the access corridor, halfway to where I was going, and crouched and looked at the joining work on a conduit run and a mounting assembly respectively. And in both cases, I understood that I was looking at work that surpassed anything I had ever personally produced. The joins were perfect in ways that commercial fabrication can't achieve. Commercial fabrication is precise, but it's the precision of repetition, of doing the same thing thousands of times with tolerances measured in fractions. This was the precision of understanding, of knowing why the tolerance mattered and what would happen at each end of it, and choosing the exact right point between them not by measurement, but by comprehension. Whoever had built these systems had understood them completely. I reached the engineering core and found the problem in approximately 4 minutes. The main drive coupling assembly, the interface between the ship's power generation matrix and its translation drive, was gone. Not damaged, not degraded, gone. The housing was there, the connection architecture was there, the surrounding systems were intact, but the core coupling matrix, the actual mechanism that translated raw power into the specific energy state that makes faster-than-light travel possible, had been reduced to something that was no longer recognizable as engineering. Slag is the word that comes to mind, though it's imprecise. It was more like the aftermath of something that had been precisely unmade. The crystalline structure of the energy conduit, the layered field generators, the harmonic resonance plates, all of it had been collapsed into fused, glassy residue at the bottom of the housing. I knelt in front of the housing and looked at it for a long time. The burn pattern on the hull suddenly resolved into perfect sense. The parallel lines, the controlled angle, the specific penetration depth, they had been designed to thread between a ship's defensive screens, through the hull, through the interior structure, and terminate in a precise strike on the translation drive coupling. Not to destroy the ship, not to breach the hull or damage life support or kill anyone aboard, just to remove the coupling matrix and leave everything else intact. To strand the ship, exactly, surgically, without collateral. Military grade, expensive, the product of very specific intelligence about this vessel's interior configuration, intelligence that would require either detailed scans over a sustained period or prior access to the ship's schematics. Or both. The word kept surfacing in my mind, the same word I'd been turning over since I first saw the burn marks from the gantry. Precision. I sat with the empty coupling housing for a while, sat with what it meant, that this ship had been deliberately, specifically, expertly disabled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they wanted to achieve. That the driver of this ship had made it here somehow, possibly with emergency sublight drives, possibly by calling in a favor for a tow, and had parked it in this bay and put up a holding deposit and disappeared. Waiting, unable to leave. Whoever fired that shot might still be looking. The smart play was to leave. I had done my preliminary assessment. I had found the problem, or rather, found the absence of what should have been the solution. I could log it in the morning. Flag the security implications. Let Olathe or someone above Olathe decide what to do about a stranded vessel whose owner had gone to ground and whose damage suggested someone with military resources wanted them kept stranded. I did not leave. I sat down on the cold deck of the engineering core, crossed my legs, and opened my toolkit. I want to explain this decision because it's the one that changed everything and it deserves explanation. It wasn't heroism, it wasn't bravery or even particularly good judgment. It was something more mechanical than that, something that had been running in me since the day I walked away from the glass office on the 47th floor. The work was there. That's the full explanation as far as I can make it. The coupling matrix was gone, and I was the one person in the outer meridian who both knew how to repair a legacy coupling matrix and had the specific knowledge of where to source the components to do it. Those two facts sat in the presence of a ship that needed exactly that repair and created a kind of gravity that I didn't know how to resist. Maybe should have tried harder to resist. Maybe not. Legacy coupling matrices are not manufactured anymore. The industry shifted about 15 years ago to integrated replacement units. Easier to install, lower failure rate, no specialist knowledge required. If your translation drive fails, you pull the integrated unit and install a new one. You don't repair, you replace. Which meant the knowledge of how to repair a matrix, how the crystalline conduit was structured, how the field generators were calibrated, how the resonance plates were tuned, had been aging out of the working population for 15 years. Most of the people who'd known it were retired or dead. The ones who were neither had generally gone into specialized consulting work that paid considerably better than overnight shifts in an outer meridian repair yard. I knew it because I'd had to know it. Because Veldtech's cross-platform integration work in the early days of my career had required me to understand every layer of every system I was integrating, including the legacy coupling matrices that the integrated units were designed to replace. I'd built the understanding for someone else's purposes, and then I'd walked away, and the understanding had come with me and sat unused for 6 years. It was about to become useful. I spent the first night doing diagnostics, mapping the damage, assessing the housing, identifying what could be reconditioned and what would need to be sourced. The housing itself was salvageable. The precision of the strike had destroyed the matrix without significantly damaging the surrounding architecture. The connection points needed reconditioning but not replacement. The field generator mounts were intact. The resonance plate anchor points were intact. What I needed was crystalline energy conduit of the specific grade used in pre-integration coupling matrices, not available commercially, not available in any catalog I had on file. Available, in my experience, in exactly one kind of place, specialty salvage. I went home at the end of my shift and started making calls. The supply chain I built over the next 2 days was deliberate in its indirection. I went through a broker on Chem Station who dealt in obsolete components and owed me a favor from a years ago job I'd helped him with off the books. He went through a salvage house on Karas IV whose owner I'd never met and who would have no context for my name. The conduit itself came from a decommissioned freighter that had been sitting in a salvage lot for 8 years. Its translation drive intact and untouched because the freighter's insurers had been locked in litigation over the claim for so long that the lot had stopped caring about the manifest and was simply collecting the parking fees. The conduit arrived in 3 days, packed as miscellaneous parts in a shipment of maintenance supplies. It cost more than my monthly salary. I paid it. I came back to Bay 7 on the 6th night with the conduit and the specialized tools the reconditioning process required. I came back on the 7th night and the 8th, working in the dark, using portable lighting I carried in my kit bag, wearing thermal underlayers because the standby atmosphere was cold enough to make the work uncomfortable, and I needed my hands to work precisely. Working in the dark, I discovered things about the ship that I wouldn't have found otherwise. In the engineering core, carved directly into a secondary access panel in a deliberate hand, was a repair log. Not a digital log, a physical inscription, letters I didn't recognize but whose format was unmistakably that of maintenance records, dates or something that served the function of dates, component identifiers, work notes. It ran for what I estimated, given the scale of the characters, at several hundred entries. The earliest entries had the character depth of inscription done with a steady tool and a practiced hand, the more recent entries done with the same tool but less steadily, as if the person carving them had been tired when they made them, or working in conditions worse than these. Someone had maintained this ship for years, alone in the field. On the deck plating near the translation drive housing, worn almost below visibility but still present if you knew to look, were a series of marks that I first interpreted as measurement guides. It took me until the third night to understand they were something else: orientations. Reference marks for working in specific positions around the coupling matrix. Marks you'd make if you needed to know exactly where to stand when you had no one to hand you tools. When every reach and every angle had to be planned in advance because you were working alone, and any mistake meant starting over. Alone, years. The same careful hands that had done the joining work in the access corridor, the work I'd stopped twice to look at and understood was beyond anything I'd ever personally achieved. I thought about what that meant. A being who had spent years maintaining a ship alone and in the field, to a standard of workmanship that put commercial yards to shame, who had been stranded by a precision military strike and had parked in this yard and gone to ground, who had done the solo maintenance marks on the deck plating not as a quirk, but as a system, a process developed and refined and executed so many times it had worn itself into the metal. I knew something about that, about the discipline of doing careful work alone, without oversight, in conditions that weren't designed for comfort, about the particular concentration required when no one is watching and no one will check, and the only standard that applies is the one you hold yourself to. I finished the coupling matrix reconditioning on the 9th night. The diagnostic sequence ran for 12 minutes. I sat on the cold deck and watched the numbers resolve, one system at a time, the way you watch a sick patient's vital signs come back, with a specific quality of attention that isn't quite hope and isn't quite certainty, but exists somewhere in between. Translation drive operational, power coupling stable, energy conduit integrity 96%, significantly better than I'd projected given the condition of the housing. Cross-system harmonics nominal, estimated drive efficiency at full power 92% relative to original factory specification. Not perfect. The integrated unit this had replaced would have run at 100%, with tolerances maintained by processes more precise than hands. But 92% was the difference between stranded and moving. 92% was more than sufficient. I sat with the diagnostic readout for a while. I thought about leaving a note, logging the work, doing the things that the legitimate version of this job would require. I thought about what a record of this repair would mean if someone was looking for this ship, about the supply chain I'd built and how long it might take someone with serious resources to trace. Then I thought about what it would mean for whoever owned this ship if they came back to find the drive still dead. I powered down my portable lighting. I closed my toolkit. I walked back through the access corridor and out the hatch and secured it behind me, and I walked back to my console on the primary maintenance floor and logged the night as routine visual inspection, Bay 7, no anomalies noted. I expected nothing in return for this, or rather, I expected the thing I always expected from the overnight shift, the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved in the dark, which is its own kind of payment and better than most. What I did not expect was to come in for my shift on the 11th night and find someone standing at my console. She was tall. That was the first thing I registered, and it sounds like a simple observation, but it wasn't tall in a way that spoke of a species designed for it, built for reach and leverage in ways that human proportions don't quite manage. Blue-gray skin, the color of deep water under overcast light, four-fingered hands held loosely at her sides, eyes that caught the ambient lighting of the maintenance floor and held it fractionally longer than physics should allow, some optical property of the iris, some particular reflectivity that gave the impression of looking at something that was paying more attention than the situation seemed to warrant. She wore a shipsuit, dark, unmarked. No insignia, no rank, no identification of any kind. The suit was clearly expensive, the materials, the fit, the way it moved with her, but worn in the way people wear good tools, without self-consciousness, without display. She was standing at my console, looking at the maintenance log. She looked at me when I came through the door, not startled, not caught, with the calm attention of someone who had been waiting and was now confirming a hypothesis. "The repair log says routine inspection," she said. Her translator was the kind that cost more than I make in a year, that handles not just language but tone and cadence and the weight behind words, so that what I heard wasn't a translation of her words but something that felt like what she would have said if she'd been speaking my language natively. Routine inspection would not have replaced a Class 7 coupling matrix. "I didn't log the matrix work," I said. "Why not?" I stood just inside the door, in the threshold zone where I hadn't quite committed to entering the room, and she hadn't quite committed to making me feel like I needed to. Because a log entry creates a record, I didn't know who might be looking at records. "You knew," she said. "You understood what the damage meant before you went inside. Someone shot your drive coupling with a precision military disruptor. They wanted you stranded, not dead. That kind of care implies they had intentions for you beyond the immediate moment." Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, not in a way I could specifically identify, but in the way a landscape shifts when the light changes, a subtle reorganization of attention. "The work is good," she said. "Better than I expected. Better than I would have believed possible here. 92% efficiency relative to factory spec. The housing limited what I could recover, but the conduit quality was better than I'd hoped. 92% is sufficient." She turned back to the console and touched something on the display, and when she turned around again, there was an object in her hand. A data chip, dark-cased, unmarked, the kind that carries either a transfer code or a data package or both. She set it on the console between us, not sliding it, not making a production of it, just placing it. "Payment," she said. "I didn't file a work order." "No, but you did the work." I looked at the chip. In this yard, in this business, a chip handed across a console without paperwork was a great number of possible things, most of them fine and some of them not. I'd want to know what I'm accepting before I accept it. It is what the repair is worth, more, by a factor that reflects what surrounded the repair. What surrounded it, the discretion, the untraceable sourcing. The dark and the cold and the 9 nights, and the fact that I'd looked 2 investigators in the eye and told them nothing. "Who are you?" I asked. She considered the question with that same quality I'd noticed when she first turned to look at me, the consideration of someone deciding not whether to answer but how much the answer costs. Someone who needed that ship to be able to move. Someone with enough enemies to have precision military weapons used against them. "Yes. And now you can move. Because of what you did." I looked at the chip again. I looked at her. At the 4-fingered hands and the deep-water skin and the expensive translator and the eyes that held light. At the way she stood, the particular verticality of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in a room, trying to stand in a room without being the most significant person in it. "The people who shot your drive," I said, "are they going to come here?" "They do not know where I am. The transit codes." "I know about the transit codes. What I'm asking is whether they'll eventually trace the path that leads here." A silence that was more informative than most answers. They have resources I don't want to underestimate. I sourced the conduit through a chain that should take serious investigative work to trace. How serious are the resources we're talking about? "Serious enough that I should leave quickly," she said. And something in how she said it, the directness of it, the lack of qualification, was the most honest thing she'd said in this exchange. "Your ship is ready," I said. "The drive is operational, you should go." She looked at me with that shifted light quality again. "You're not going to ask." "Ask what?" "Who I am, what I was carrying, what the stakes were. Most humans in this situation would. Most humans in this situation would ask things that might get them in trouble later, or would make them feel better in the moment and worse afterward. I met her eyes. The light-holding quality was easier to look at directly than I'd expected. I'm asking you to leave while you still have a clear window. Everything else can wait, or doesn't need to happen at all. Another silence, longer and of a different character than the previous ones. Then she did something I didn't expect. She picked up the data chip, and for a moment I thought she was reconsidering the payment, and then she set it back down closer to me, on my side of the console. The work was extraordinary, she said, not a compliment deployed to end a conversation, a statement that meant something specific. Go, I said. She went. I stood at my console in the quiet of the maintenance floor and listened to the yard. After a while, the sounds of Bay 7 system cycling up came through the floor, the atmospheric seal repressurizing, the internal power coming online, the specific harmonics of a translation drive moving from standby to active. A good translation drive has a sound to it, just at the threshold of hearing, like a sustained note that exists more in the chest than in the ears. This one sounded clean. 92%, but clean. The sound faded. The bay sensors showed empty. I picked up the data chip and put it in my kit bag and finished my shift. 3 weeks later, 2 ships came through the transit entry on what the station logged as a customs inspection run. They docked at the commercial pier with credentials that looked official from a distance and dissolved under any examination that took longer than a glance. I was on shift when they came to the yard. I watched from the upper gantry as 4 individuals in civilian dress moved through the bays with the particular efficiency of professionals looking for something specific. They were not Vrenthai. Something else, bipedal, pale gray, built narrowly with a quality of movement that was almost too smooth, like the visible portion of a mechanism that extended beyond what you could see. They carried scanners openly, which meant they had authorization documentation solid enough to make open carrying possible without causing an incident, or they decided that confident display was better protection than concealment. They went to Bay 7 first. I watched them find an empty dock and a clean floor and 11 days of nothing. Watched the lead one crouch and run a scan across the deck plating. Watched them confer in a cluster too tight for words to carry, then split into pairs and disperse through the yard. One pair came toward the maintenance office. I came down from the gantry and walked to my console and sat down and opened the overnight log and started working through the routine items with the concentration of someone who had a great deal to do and was barely aware of anything else. You work the overnight shift. I looked up, the taller of the 2, scanner still active in hand. The translator was functional but not expensive. It caught language but not weight. 6 years, I said. Bay 7, large vessel, dark hull, Vrenthai modification class, arrived approximately 37 days ago. You are aware of it. I let the statement sit for a moment. A lot of ships come through holding. That one had a transit flag on it. No work order active, nothing for me to engage with. You performed no work on it. Without a work order, I can't bill for work. Without billing, there's no work. The scanner came up. I held still for the scan with the ease of someone who scans clean because there's nothing to find, which was accurate. The chip was in my quarters, inside a technical manual I'd been reading since before any of this started. Nothing on me, nothing in my kit bag, nothing at my console. Your logs show routine visual inspection. That's what I do with everything in holding. Walk past, confirm the dock is stable, log the check. Anything more needs a work order. The pale gray eyes held mine for a long moment. I returned the gaze with the mild, slightly distracted patience of someone who had tasks to get back to, and was being cooperative, but not at the cost of the whole shift. They left. The 4 regrouped at the commercial pier. Their ships departed within the hour. I finished my shift. I went home. I sat in my quarters with the data chip in my reader and worked through the encryption for 20 minutes and read what was inside. A transfer code. The sum was significant enough that I read it twice to confirm I hadn't misplaced a decimal. And beneath the transfer code, a data packet, and inside the packet a message. Short, direct, the writing of someone accustomed to saying precisely what they mean and nothing more. The repair you performed saved a life, not only mine. I was returning to my people carrying something they needed. If you ever require return, passage, protection, or resources, send on this relay. It is monitored continuously. Use the phrase, "The work was good." And below that, a symbol I didn't recognize. And below the symbol, a name. Savaloran. And below the name, in smaller characters, primary heir sovereign of the Vrenthai collective, Queen in exile. I read it 3 times. The hand-carved repair log, the solo maintenance marks worn into the deck plating, the modifications built by one pair of hands over years of field work, the precision military strike from someone with the intelligence to know exactly which component would strand her without killing her. 8 investigators willing to travel 3-star systems to find her. Queen in exile, running, stranded, working on her own ship in the dark for years, alone, with the same discipline and the same standard I'd spent 6 years developing in a different context on a different station. Fixed by me, routine inspection Bay 7, no anomalies. I put the chip down and sat with the ceiling for a long time. 6 months passed. I worked my shifts. I moved the transfer into an account that couldn't easily be attributed and spent from it carefully, below the threshold of patterns that trigger attention. I read about the Vrenthai collective in the news feeds, the succession crisis, the factions, the external interests who'd been maneuvering in the instability for the better part of a decade. The kind of news that exists in the background of your life, until a specific piece of it intersects with your specific experience, and suddenly the background resolves into foreground. 7 months after she'd left my bay, I had a shift that went badly in ways I'd had no mechanism to predict. A plasma conduit failure that cascaded through a customer's ship and destroyed 6 months of delicate restoration work, and a conversation with Olathe afterward that ended with a formal reprimand and a quality flag on my record. I sat in the break room at 4 in the morning and stared at the ceiling and thought, without quite planning to, about the relay address. I thought about the message, about what it would mean to use it. I thought about what I actually wanted if I was being honest with myself about it. And what I actually wanted wasn't rescue or passage or resources. What I wanted was what she'd given me when she left my bay, the clean and undemanding fact of it. Here is what I can provide if you need it. No obligation to need it. No expectation attached. The door, just the door. I didn't use the relay. I went home, slept, came back the next shift, and fixed what could be fixed and documented what couldn't and kept working. But I thought about the door differently after that night. Less like something I might need and more like something I already had, and that having it was itself the thing. 8 months after she'd left, a diplomatic vessel docked at Meridian Station for the first time in 6 years. I heard about it before I saw it, the chatter on the yard comms, the security sweep requests, the deference in the way the station systems processed the arrival. I was on my shift when it came through the approach lane and docked at the main commercial pier with the slow ceremony of something that knew its own weight. The vessel was Vrenthai, unmistakably. You can see it in the hull geometry, the specific way the aesthetic principles of a species translate into the architecture of the things they build. And it was new, not repaired, not modified, not the accumulation of years of field work. Pristine in the way that only official things can be pristine, when resources and attention are applied with institutional backing rather than a single pair of careful hands. I was at my console when she came through the entrance of the repair yard. She was wearing different clothes. The kind that announce themselves not through ostentation but through the weight they carry, the formal garment as a statement of identity, as a claim, as a fact about who the person wearing it is and what they represent. At her collar, embroidered in a thread that caught the maintenance floor's functional lighting and made something richer of it, the symbol I'd seen at the bottom of her message. She had people with her. Significant people, in significant clothes, moving with the restrained gravity of individuals who understood that their role in this moment was to flank rather than lead. They knew it and performed it well. She walked toward my console and stood in front of it, and I stood up. "The work was good," she said. The way she said it, not the phrase from the message, or rather, the phrase from the message but not deployed as a code. Said the way I'd said it, 9 nights into a cold, dark bay with a diagnostic readout showing 92%, as a simple statement of what was true. "The exile is over," I said. It wasn't a question. "The exile is over." She looked at the bay around us. The ordinary infrastructure of the repair yard, the gantries, the consoles, the tools, the scale of it completely indifferent to anything that wasn't broken or fixed. I came back through the outer meridian because I wanted to, a pause, that quality of consideration. I came back because I wanted to say what I didn't have time to say before I left. "You said what needed saying." "I told you the work was extraordinary. I didn't tell you what the work was." I waited. I was carrying the documentation for a succession claim that 3 external parties had been working for 8 years to suppress. The exile wasn't flight, it was transit. I was moving the documentation to people who could protect it and use it. If I had not been able to complete that transit, she stopped, restarted. The succession would have resolved in favor of interests that were not Vrenthai. The 7 systems of the collective, and the 43 million individuals in them, would have been governed by those interests for a generation. The coupling matrix, the 9 nights, the untraceable conduit, the 2 investigators I'd looked in the eye and told nothing. "I didn't know," I said. "No, you knew only that the ship was broken and that you could fix it, and you fixed it." She reached into her suit and produced a small object, dark metal, dense and heavy, engraved with the symbol from her collar. She set it on my console between us, the same way she'd set the data chip, without ceremony, without performance, just placing a thing where it needed to be. "Among my people," she said, "this is given when work has been done that cannot be settled by payment. The one who receives it carries what we would call an unsettled debt, but the word in our language doesn't translate as deficit. It translates closer to a bond that will not close. It is given as an honor, not a burden." I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Most things that matter are. "I fixed a drive coupling," I said. "You fixed it in the dark, 9 nights, alone, without a work order, without logging it, with components you sourced through channels specifically constructed to leave no trace. When investigators came looking, you looked them in the eyes and gave them nothing. You did this for a ship you'd never seen the owner of. At personal risk, you understood clearly, because the work needed doing and you were the one who could do it." She paused. "The drive coupling is not what you fixed." I looked at the object in my hand, at the weight of it. "The relay address," I said, "is it still live?" "It will be live as long as I hold this position." A pause that was the closest thing to lightness I'd heard from her. "Somewhat longer now." I nodded. I set the object down carefully on the corner of my console where I could see it. I thought about 43 million people who would never know the name of the overnight shift tech who'd fixed a coupling matrix in the dark and logged nothing and said nothing. That was fine. That was how this kind of work went. "The drive was running at 92%, I said. "If you want to bring the ship back in, I can look at the efficiency gap. Shouldn't take more than a few nights. I have a better handle on the housing tolerances now. I think I can recover another 3 or 4%. Something moved in her face. Something I'd first seen crack through the stillness at my console 8 months ago, when I'd told her I was very curious but didn't need her to satisfy it. The same thing, more visible now, or perhaps I was simply better at reading it. "I'll have it brought in," she said. "Bay 7, the seal is working, plenty of room," I paused. "I'll get it to 96, maybe 97. I want to look at the resonance plates. I didn't have time to do the full calibration on the 9th night, and I've been thinking about it since." She looked at me with that quality of sustained attention that I'd come to understand was not the examination it appeared to be. It was more like recognition. The recognition of someone who does careful work alone in the dark, to a standard no one but themselves will ever audit, seeing the same quality in someone else. "The work was good," she said again. "The work was 92%, I said. "Give me another few nights." She left with her people, out through the yard and back to the diplomatic pier. I sat down at my console and pulled up the overnight log and started on the things that needed doing. I put the dark metal object in my kit bag next to the tools, and I went to work. Some jobs you do because you're paid. Some you do because they're there and you're the one who can do them. Some, the ones that stay with you, the ones that sit heavy and good in the chest for years after you do, because leaving a broken thing broken, when you have the knowledge and the time and the hands to fix it, is a kind of failure you can't accept. I fixed her ship because the ship was broken and I knew how. That she was the queen of the Vrenthi collective, carrying the future of 43 million people in her translation drive, that came after. That came because of the work, not before it. The right order, the only order that makes sense. The bay was quiet. The plasma tools hummed somewhere on the upper levels. The station breathed. I logged the night open and settled in and got to work, the same as every other night, the same ordinary hands doing the same careful work in the same cold air. 92% wasn't good enough. We could do better. We were going to do better. The ship came back in 2 days later. I heard it before I saw it. The approach sensors in Bay 7 pinging the incoming vessel's transponder, the atmospheric seal cycling up, the heavy bay doors grinding open on their tracks with the particular sound of machinery that was old but well-maintained and intended to last another several decades. I was at the far end of the maintenance floor doing a plasma conduit inspection on a mid-range hauler when the sensors pinged, and I finished the inspection before I went to look, because that's the discipline of the overnight shift, the task in front of you before the task on the horizon. But I went. It looked different this time, coming in under its own power instead of sitting there silent and cold. The translation drive hum was there again, that subchest frequency that a clean drive makes, fading as it powered down to standby. The ship settled into Bay 7 with the particular care of a vessel whose pilot knew its exact dimensions and could place it precisely, and the bay doors closed, and the atmospheric seal pressurized, and the lights in Bay 7 came up automatically because that was the protocol for an active maintenance dock. Nobody got off. I suited up thermal underlayers, full kit bag, portable lighting, and went in. The hatch was sealed but, as before, not locked against the 3-pulse sequential. I went through. The interior was warmer this time, life support at full operational. The lights were on, actual ship lighting, not my portable kit, filling the corridors with the blue-white light that Vrenthi interior design seems to prefer, functional and clear, and without the warmth that human lighting usually chases. I walked the access corridor again, and again I stopped twice without planning to. In the 8 months since I'd last been here, something had changed. Or rather, I had. The joining work in the conduit runs, the mounting assembly precision, I'd stopped to look at them before because they were better than anything I'd personally produced. That was still true, but this time I could see more specifically why. The tolerances I'd noticed as extraordinary before were now legible in a way they hadn't been 8 months ago. I could identify the specific choices being made at each junction, could trace the logic of the approach across the run of the corridor, could see how a decision made at one point reflected forward into 3 subsequent ones. The work was still extraordinary. Now I could read it the way you can only read a text when you know the language. 8 months of thinking about a problem. 8 months of understanding, incrementally and without planning it, what she'd been doing in this engineering core alone in the dark for years. I reached the coupling matrix housing and crouched in front of it, and ran the full diagnostic before I touched anything. The numbers from my reconditioning were holding. 92%, stable, no degradation in the conduit or the resonance plates. The matrix had been running, she'd used it, the drive had functioned. She'd made the transits she needed to make and arrived where she needed to arrive and done what the exile had been covering. The 9 nights in the dark had been enough. But 92 wasn't 97, and I'd told her 97. And I had the time now and the specific knowledge of this housing's idiosyncrasies that I hadn't had before, and I was going to do the job properly. I started with the resonance plates. This is the most painstaking part of a legacy coupling calibration, and the part most likely to be skipped or approximated, because the tolerance windows are extremely narrow, and the feedback is subtle enough that you can convince yourself you're within spec when you're actually at the edge of it. Commercial systems handle this with automated calibration routines. Legacy matrices handle it with someone who knows what they're listening for. I'd been trained to run the calibration by ear and by vibration. Literally, by placing a hand against the plate housing and feeling for the frequency that indicated correct calibration versus the fraction of a cycle off frequency that indicated almost but not quite. It's a skill that takes a long time to develop, and that most people who need it now derive from instruments rather than from sense. Instruments are accurate, but they measure what they're set to measure. The hand feels everything. I worked through the plates one by one. 3 hours. Sitting cross-legged on the deck in the blue-white ship lighting, one hand on a plate housing and the other holding a calibration tool, moving in increments small enough that they required full concentration to track. It's meditative, work like this. The kind that empties the thinking parts of the mind and fills them with something that isn't thought and isn't feeling exactly, but occupies the same space and leaves you afterward, with a quality of rest you can't achieve any other way. I heard her come in somewhere during the 2nd hour. I didn't stop what I was doing. I heard the footsteps in the access corridor, a particular gate, 4-point and even, and with that quality of movement I'd cataloged on the maintenance floor, and I heard them stop at the engineering core entrance, and I continued with the plate I was calibrating. The plates, she said after a moment. They were at 94% calibration. That was within operational spec but below optimal. I'm bringing them up. I didn't look away from the housing. It'll take another hour, maybe slightly less. She didn't say anything. After a moment I heard her settle, not leaving, but not standing at attention either, sitting probably on the secondary housing or the deck. The position of someone who had spent a long time doing things in this room, and knew which surfaces were comfortable to sit on. I kept working. The silence between us was the silence of 2 people doing the same kind of work in the same space, even though only one of us was actively working. She knew what I was doing and why it mattered and what it required. I knew she knew. That knowing was its own kind of company. After 40 minutes I said, without stopping, "You did the plate calibration by feel." "Yes." "The marks on the deck, the orientation marks. You positioned yourself specifically to run the calibration one-handed while stabilizing against the housing." A pause. "You found the marks." "Early on, I didn't understand them at first. It took me until the 3rd night. They took me longer than that to develop." Another pause. "I built this ship, most of it. The base frame was Vrenthi commercial, but the systems, the drive, the navigation, the life support configuration, I replaced them over a period of years. When the coupling matrix first needed reconditioning, I was in a system without any support infrastructure. I had to teach myself. The plate under my hand was at 96. I eased the calibration tool another increment. You taught yourself from documentation. From the machine itself, I understood the theory. The practice required iterations. The word landed with a particular weight, the weight of something that had cost something. The first reconditioning was not good, 78%. Functional but degraded. I did it again 6 months later when I had better access to components, 87. Again the following year, 91. I felt the plate settle into true calibration, the vibration under my hand resolving from almost right to exactly right, the frequency dropping into the specific groove of correct. I lifted my hand and moved to the next plate. 92 wasn't a ceiling, I said. I was limited by the components and the time, not the housing. I know, a beat. I read your work, after I left, went back through the engineering core with time to look properly. The conduit runs you built into the existing housing, the way you worked around the fused sections rather than removing them. I wouldn't have done it that way. I would have tried to clear them. Clearing them would have risked the housing integrity. The fused sections were providing structural support the original design hadn't accounted for. Yes, I saw that afterward, a pause that felt like something considered and decided. I've been doing this for 11 years. You found an approach I didn't have. 97 on the plate, the last one. I placed my hand. You taught yourself to do this alone, I said. That's not the same as learning it in a system that's been stripped down to just you and the machine. Different pressures, different errors, different solutions. You did the same. I learned it in a context where failure had organizational consequences. You learned it in a context where failure meant being stranded. I felt the plate, felt the frequency. You probably have more respect for the tolerance windows than I do. I have more room for novel approaches because I had a safety margin you didn't. The plate settled into true. I lifted my hand. I ran the diagnostic sequence. 97.3%. All systems nominal. The resonance plates across the board showing calibration I was satisfied with. Calibration that the integrated units were designed to match, but rarely exceeded in field conditions. Done, I said. I heard her get up. She crossed to where I was crouched by the housing and looked at the diagnostic readout. 97.3, she said. The housing has a variance on the number 3 plate that I can't fully compensate for without physical modification. If you want to do that modification at some point, I can design it. You get to 99, possibly slightly above. 97.3 is sufficient, I said. I know, but the gap matters. She looked at me. You came back, she said. You could have left it at 92. The work was done. I was gone. No one would have known. I would have known. I closed the diagnostic and started packing my tools. I told you 97. The silence stretched long enough to have a shape. The modification, she said, for number 3 plate. If I wanted to have it done, I'd need to spend about 2 hours in here first, taking measurements and modeling the variance. After that, I could draft the modification spec. The physical work would be about 4 hours, maybe 5. You'd want to be docked somewhere stable. The plate housing needs to be fully accessible, and you don't want to be under motive power during. Could you do it here, while the ship is docked? Bay 7's atmospheric seal gives you a stable work environment. Yes. Another silence. I'm in the outer meridian for 3 more days, she said. I work nights, I said. The bay's available. Bring the ship in tomorrow and I'll take the measurements and run the model. The night after, I'll do the physical work. She looked at me for a moment. That quality of attention that had started to feel like the specific attention of someone who was categorizing a thing they hadn't previously had a category for. You said you were a systems integrator, she said. I was. Why here? Why this work? I thought about the glass box on the 47th floor, the committees, the frameworks built with precision and simplified into mediocrity by people who were afraid of excellence they couldn't personally verify. The slow erosion of what the work actually was under the weight of what the work was supposed to look like. Because here, I said, the work is the work. I shouldered my kit bag. Tomorrow night, base 7, I'll have the measurement tools. She walked me out through the access corridor. At the hatch she stopped, and I stopped, and she looked at the corridor around us, at the conduit runs, the mounting assemblies, the work I'd done 9 months ago in the dark. When I built this ship, she said, I thought I was building something for myself, a thing I could maintain and control and trust because I'd built it myself and knew every part of it. A pause. I didn't anticipate someone else understanding it. No one anticipates that, I said. That's what makes it valuable when it happens. She looked at me one more time. The work was good, she said. Wait until I fix the number 3 plate, I said. Then we'll talk. She almost smiled, I think. The expression was subtle enough that I wasn't certain, but something in the arrangement of her face had shifted in a direction that, on a human, I would have read as the beginning of one. I went back through the hatch and out through the bay and back to the maintenance floor and logged the night. Routine inspection, base 7, systems nominal. I put the dark metal object back in my kit bag beside the tools, and I sat at my console, and I thought about a queen who had rebuilt her own ship from the inside out, and maintained it alone in the dark for 11 years, and whose number 3 resonance plate had a variance I was going to fix. I thought about the work there was left to do. In the outer meridian, on the overnight shift, with the plasma tools humming above and the station breathing its slow breath all around, that thought sat in me clean and good and sufficient. The same as every other night. The same ordinary hands. We were going to get to 99.